Hello, it's Elfreda of Metta-morphics. I was having a conversation recently with a friend about the level of activation and stress that seems to be in people at the moment when you're out and about. And he was commenting on how he'd noticed that people's driving seems to have changed and that they seem to be a little bit more aggressive or forceful on the roads, and that he was noticing it when he was out and about in shops or dealing with people in the public arena. And so we were discussing about how our autonomic nervous system responds when we're experiencing a sense of threat or when we're feeling vulnerable. And I was explaining to him about how at the moment, a lot of people are functioning on a higher level of hypervigilance than they would have been, say, previously before the COVID-19 pandemic. And the reason that we're on a level of hypervigilance that is different is that we've been in this environment for so long where we've been cautious about how close people have stood to us, are they wearing masks, how are we when we're out in the world, are we feeling safe? And so this level of constantly checking to see what is happening around me pushes us into a state of hypervigilance where we're all the time looking to see what's going on. And I gave the perfect example to my friend in our discussions where I was in a supermarket recently and there was a gentleman who was a couple of people in front of me in the queue, and the supermarket was quite busy. And he was standing in the queue with a tub of sweets with his children around him, who were obviously getting sweets for their weekend. It was a Saturday. And I could see the level of activation in him starting to build. He was, looking around all the time, looking at the other queues, looking at the people in front. He was moving on his feet all the time. And I was watching as this was happening, and his movements were quite quick and darting. His children were speaking to him and he was ignoring them. He wasn't even able to give them his attention. And then as we were standing there, obviously, as people often do, he let out a loud comment, excuse my language, where he said, "Oh, for fuck's sake," because the queues were so busy. And I was watching this again, observing it and saying, right, okay, he's either going into fight or flight. Which is it going to be? Because I could see the level of activation. And then suddenly, as if out of the blue, he put the sweets back. He walked out of the shop with his children, who were both going, "Oh, daddy, why are we leaving? What's happening? And he went straight out of the shop and left. Now that's a typical flight response where his stress levels were so overwhelming that he just couldn't stay anymore and he had to get out of there. Now, from the perspective of his children or the people around him, they might not have even noticed this level of activation in him or the increase in his stress levels. And so when he did this, it would have seemed totally out of the blue. It would have seemed, unexpected, which often happens when somebody explodes or somebody storms off. We think, well, what did I do? What was going on? Because we're not aware of it. Now, I'm not saying that we need to be aware of it. Obviously, it's really useful if you can be, and especially if it's a loved one or a family member, that you can recognize the level of activation that's coming into their system. But what's important is to notice the level of activation that's coming into our own system. So, if you're sitting in the car outside the supermarket and you're already in a state of dread and thinking, oh, I hate going in here and it's going to take so long and there's probably going to be loads of people, you're already setting yourself up for a level of activation. And so to me, that says, well, maybe pick a different time where that level of activation won't be there, or do something to support yourself to bring down that level of activation in your nervous system. That may be taking some slow breaths, so breathing in and then breathing out for a longer count. So if you breathe in, say, for 6 and breathe out for 8, that activates the vagus nerve and it can help us to slow things down, get us into a more ventral state, which is how we want to be, which is where we feel safe and connected. And so we can also obviously anticipate things. So one of the things that's useful is thinking about, well, what will happen if? So before you go in, say, well, if this happens, what am I going to do? Because remember, we're driven by a desire to feel safe. And so if we do things that help us to feel safe, we immediately feel better. So if I'm going into the supermarket and it is going to be busy, I might say, okay, well, if it's really busy, what will I do? Will I stay? Will I go? Having a conversation with the person with you to say, look, if we go into the supermarket and it's crazy busy, I'm just going to leave and I'll come back later. Those kind of things help in the connection with the relationship. But it's just about anticipating and recognizing. So that's one of the things that I find mindfulness is so helpful for, because we can begin to recognize what's happening. There's tension in my body. My breathing has speed up. There's knots in my shoulders. I'm tensing or clenching my fists. I'm, running a story, because there's always a story of this is difficult, or I'm too tired, or I hate this, or I don't want to do this, or I don't feel good enough. There's always a story. And when we pay attention to the story, then we can recognize how that story impacts us as well. If we bring ourselves into a calmer or more relaxed state, we can pay attention to the difference in the story, which might be, this is okay, or you can handle it, or why don't you do this instead? And so if you're noticing your own level of activation and what happens to you when you're activated, then it's much easier to navigate stressful situations. If you'd like to find out more about what I do, please get in touch. You can find more of my videos on YouTube. You can connect with me via social media. If you'd like to work with me as your coach, then book a free 30-minute session with me. I'm more than happy to discuss that process.